and that wasn't even your first rock festival, was it? How on earth did you have the nerve at that age to think about putting on a rock festival?
Stupidity, I guess. So, you know, it was a product of the times, and I was very inspired by Monterey pop.
Yeah.
And then the next year, in 1968, did a festival in Miami called Miami Pop. Well, Miami Pop was a much simpler operation than putting Woodstock together, because we did it at a fixed facility. It was at Gulfstream Park, which was a horse track in Miami. But what impressed me was the effect it had on the audience. Miami was certainly sort of off the circuit at that particular point in terms of what was happening in music. But it really transformed the kids who came. And the Saturday was magical. We had about 40,000 kids, and then, of course, Sunday it rained. That was my first experience with rain, and got rained out.
When I was in Berlin, the wall went up. The Berlin Wall went up, and I photographed the wall. And I sent the pictures and a story about the wall being built to my hometown newspaper. I said, wait a minute, this is my hobby, and I'm getting paid for my hobby. I think I'm going to make my hobby into my profession. And that was the day that really, my demarcation line, that I became a professional photographer. Another photographer, a really well-known photographer, Jim Marshall, and I got a book contract to tour festivals of the U.S. It was called Festival, a Book of American Music Celebrations. And we went to all kinds of festivals. When we started out on our journey that year, we didn't know about Woodstock. You knew about Woodstock. We didn't know about Woodstock. And we hadn't heard about it. And then halfway through our journey, we began to see the promotion for Woodstock, and we said, we better include that particular, your concert in our group. And so that's how we ended up at Woodstock, Jim and I.
Now, this remarkable book here of Baron's photographs, and also a really interesting conversation between Baron and Michael, it's called Woodstock. And it's the Woodstock generation. It's, you know, Woodstock as this great totem of late 60s culture. And how many miles away was the festival from Woodstock when you eventually put it on?
It's about 70 miles.
Okay.
We found this farm in Saugerties, which is about 12 miles outside of Woodstock, and that's where the '94 festival, 25th anniversary, took place.
Right.
It was not the ideal site, but when we were able to sort of start transforming, it had the essentials. It had water, it had access, it had enough ground to cover, and Wokel also had this other feature, which was a very concerned citizens committee. And the town fathers passed a law which basically prohibited us from being able to do the festival. This was about a month before we were scheduled.
So by this point, you have been selling tickets.
We were selling tickets.
Yeah.
We had been booked. We had been advertising and been building, you know, transforming the site for 3 months. And the miracle of Woodstock is the next day we found the site in Bethel, the perfect place. I mean, it was the dream field, and so we just loaded the trucks and moved everybody to Bethel.
And for people who don't know, that site was the farm owned by Max Yasgur.
Yes, that was the ideal we'd been looking for. And who owns this? Max Yasgur. Where does he live? Down the road. And he was the biggest dairy farmer in the area. And it turned out that he was having a bad summer for hay and needed money to feed his cows. And so we went back out to the site, and Max and I made a deal on the spot, and that was what saved us. He was a very stand-up guy. He never wavered for a minute and really stood by us through the whole thing.
Yeah. And what had you found, Baron, at the previous festivals when you've been traveling around America? It's such a different time to today. Can you give me a sort of a sense of what it was like to be going to those festivals in 1969?
Well, I think the fundamental difference between this festival and all the other ones was the size. Just that the type of music that each person liked was a little different, but there was a camaraderie at every one of those festivals.
Part of the fun for me was discovering new talent, bringing people like Joe Cocker and Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young and Santana, who had never really been known in the States or at all, and you know, picking talent that we felt would resonate. There were some bands and some artists that we wanted to have but couldn't. John Lennon being the most notable because he wasn't allowed in the country.
Yeah.
I must say that all the photographers pretty much had access to the musicians at Woodstock. There was a very large pit, right? And the photographers could move up and down the pit at will and walk around at will. Not everybody could get on the stage, but you didn't need to in order to get some really good pictures. You weren't, as they are today, you weren't confined to one small area where everybody gets the same picture. The only way you're going to get good pictures in a situation like that is to have access. I mean, if they take access away from you, they limit your ability to do the best job you can as a photographer.
It certainly looks from the photographs around the room here and in the book, they're people, they're individual people, and you actually start to think, what was their story like? What was their experience like of the festival?
Well, you know, that's something that Baron got right very early on, which was that the audience was really the star of this event.
And I had no idea that it was going to be historically important, but I knew that it was so unique that it really needed to be kind of recorded in a different way than just standing on the stage and taking pictures of bands and taking pictures of the audience.
You know, amongst the people who lived in the area, it was people, the cops, everybody sort of felt that this was, you know, a time a human time, you know, for all of us to really relish.
And you put 500,000 people anywhere on the planet, and somebody's going to murder somebody, aren't they? But they didn't do it at Woodstock.
And the way we put it together, because nothing had ever been done on this scale before, was I had sent people down to public events, basketball games, football games, train stations, and timed people going to the bathroom. And then we take those figures, and then we transpose them into sort of how many partisans.
Times like 200,000, right?
Yeah, exactly. And did the same thing with waste and with garbage. And I stayed on site. I had a trailer backstage and used it for about an hour a night.
Did you spend the whole weekend camping out, or
Me?
did you? Well, I just. If it's not too painful a subject, what can you tell us about rain?
There was lots of it. And it's really what threw our schedule off. That's why things got so late, because when the rains would get heavy, you'd have to sort of shut down so musicians wouldn't get fried and wait for the rain to stop and then clean the stage, dry everything off, and get started up again. It's funny, but that sort of really solidified this community together. I mean, you'd expect people to sort of take off and head for the hills, but nobody did. Everybody sort of hunkered together and shared whatever. And once the rain stopped, made this, you know, amazing amusement park out of it. I mean, the mudslides everywhere, and people were covered and just had a party with it.
That picture there is of, they're climbing on the towers, and there's a guy on the tower completely naked, full frontal nudity. So I sent a bunch of prints, including that particular one, and that's the one they ran. But when they sent it back to me, the print they sent back to me, they had airbrushed underpants on the gun. Everybody pretty much gave each other permission to do anything they wanted to do as long as it wasn't hurtful to somebody else. And I think that spirit just pervaded the entire festival, and nobody saw what the photographers were doing as an assault upon their person or their privacy or anything like that. In those days, we had no autofocus, we had no auto exposure. I stayed away from that.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. Otherwise, this would be a very different book.
It much should have. They would have to Photoshop them into focus. Yeah. The book is absolutely beautifully produced. I mean, I got to give credit to Tony. I've seen my pictures published in many books before, but virtually never this good. When you get a chance to look at it, you'll see the reproduction is as good as an actual print, you know, and that's rare to find. How
did Woodstock change you?
You know, it changed the way you sort of related to people. It changed your perspective on, you know, what the world was about and how people can interact with each other. And, you know, for me, it was a very confirming experience in terms of, you know, the faith that you had in the human race and its ability to actually maybe survive and come together in a more compassionate way. And
it changed me subsequently because I began to see that some of my pictures might have some historical value. Events that I photographed were not going to be repeated. They were singular events, and that the pictures themselves had some value to the future societies who wanted to study what was going on in the 60s, in the late 60s.
Era.
Yeah, it's when the music business went from a business to an industry.
Yeah.
You know, it started to become corporatized, you know, stock options.
The business of music become bigger than the music itself. There
Yeah.
was almost a demarcation line. And what I've always said about Woodstock is Woodstock wasn't created for a profit. You didn't want to lose money, but it was not profit motivated. But once the promoters saw what was possible at Woodstock, then dollar signs started spinning in their eyes and everything changed.